What's going on, everybody? Top 10 Pokemon back, bringing you your favorite weekly series, the Pokemon Card Auctions of the Week recap. Folks, once again, I have an amazing recap for you. In today's video, we'll be going over a recent auction sale of the Black Label Moonbryon VMAX that came through, and it hit an insane price this week, along with a couple of vintage cards, some of which hit new record prices. We're going to go over all of that and more, so please stay tuned to the very end. I appreciate you tuning in. Quick shout out to today's auction recap sponsor. It is the one and only lowpopping.com, your source for investment-worthy Pokemon cards. If you are a collector of high-end Pokemon cards, you need to go check out the brand new inventory on lowpopping.com, where they feature a ton of PSA, CGC, and BGS graded Pokemon cards spanning across the entire Pokemon TCG. They have recently refreshed their inventory with brand new Pokemon card rails, a lot of which you won't find anywhere else. And yes, if you don't have the cash on hand, you can still trade for or make offers on just about anything you see. Lowpopping.com is a must for anyone in the market for Pokemon card rails. I will put a link to their website in the description of this video. Support the channel, go check them out, and let me know what you pick up. Alright folks, let's start this recap off with some modern cards, some raw modern card sales. Here we have two of the Mew EX Special Illustration Rares from Paldean Fates that sold for $570, along with four of the Charizard EX cards, also from Paldean Fates. One of these lots sold for $545, and the other one sold for $645. However, unfortunately, Probstein did not put pictures of the backs of these cards, so as far as condition goes, we don't know, but there you go. We also saw this full art Mario Pikachu that sold raw for $4,550, and there was a picture of the back of this card, and that is an absolutely insane price for a raw card. A couple of Black Label cards that came through. Here is the Rainbow Rare Charizard V-Star from Brilliant Stars that sold for $1,821. Here is a Black Label Glaceon VMAX from Evolving Skies that sold for $3,056. Here is a Black Label Origin Form Palkia V from Astral Radiance, sold for $3,938. And then here is a Black Label Japanese Charizard and Reshiram GX that sold for $3,969. And then here it is, folks, the Black Label Umbreon VMAX from Evolving Skies reared its head again in auction and sold for $13,310. So folks, despite this card having an increase in population of both PSA 10s, BGS 10s, CGC 10s, it still continues to skyrocket. Man, there's just no denying the popularity of this guy right here. We saw several PSA 10 cards from the XY era. Here is the Full Art Darkrai EX from Breakpoint that sold this week for $520. From Ancient Origins, we saw two Full Art Giratina EX cards in PSA 10. This one here sold for $750. The other one sold for even $800. And then again from Ancient Origins is this Mega Rayquaza EX that just keeps rising week after week. As a PSA 10 this week, it sold for $3,950. Several cards came by from Fates Collide. Here is a Full Art Alakazam EX, sold for $370, while the Secret Rare Full Art Alakazam EX sold for $1,326. And then we also saw this Mega Alakazam EX Full Art card sell for $635. Here's an Umbreon EX that sold for $1,400, while this other PSA 10 copy sold for $1,460. Here's a Full Art Glaceon EX that sold for $448, and then again for $449. Here is an Espeon EX from Breakpoint, sold for $650. And then here is a Mega Mewtwo EX from Breakthrough that sold for $1,375 this week. Here are several cards from XY Generations. Here's a Full Art Zapdos that sold for an even $800. Here's the Sylveon EX that sold for $830. Here's the Mega Gardevoir EX that sold for $1,550. And then here we saw a Full Art Yveltal EX Black Star promo that sold for $2,500. And then lastly, for our modern cards on eBay, we saw this PSA 10 Chinese Mew EX card that sold for $14,900, a very low pop card as a PSA 10. Up next, we have some vintage cards, and let's start off with a bang. We have this PSA 10 first edition base set Blastoise that sold for a whopping $40,250. However, this is not the highest auction price we've seen for this card. I think back in late 2020, we saw this guy sell for about $45,000, but $40,000 is getting pretty close to the all-time auction sale of this card. Here is a base 2 Magneton Holo in PSA 10 that sold for $2,375. And anytime I see a Magneton sell for this much, I gotta like, really? This is a very low pop card also, so there you go. Here is a first edition Flareon Holo from Jungle that sold for $3,001 this week. Here, check this out, folks. A first edition Gengar Holo from Fossil hit a new record price, I do believe, selling as a PSA 10 for $8,797. And this guy has a pretty new cert on it, and might be the most expensive card from Fossil set. From Team Rocket set, we saw this first edition Dark Magneton, the lowest pop holo from Team Rocket, sold for $7,450 this week as a PSA 10. Here is a first edition Dark Charizard that sold for $6,600. From Gym Challenge, we saw the CGC-10 Pristine Unlimited Blaine's Charizard that sold for $1,901, while the first edition PSA 10 copy of this card sold for $6,300. One card from the Neo series, and it was this first edition Wobbuffet from Neo Discovery that sold for $998. Here, folks, we have the complete lot of the unlimited cards from Neo Destiny, all of the non-holos, all the holos, all the shinings, and even includes this Japanese Shining Mew that sold for a grand total of $5,069 US. Here we have a PSA 10 reverse holo Charmander from Legendary Collection that was also autographed by Mitsuhiro Arita and sold for $3,755 this week. Along with this reverse holo Mewtwo, also from Legendary Collection, sold as a PSA 10 for $7,103. Several cards from the EX era. Here is a Team Magma's Groudon in PSA 10, sold for $1,515. And then we also saw this Suicune EX that sold for $5,600. Here is a Team Magma's Houndoom that sold for $925. And then we saw the Dark Houndoom from EX Team Rocket Returns, sold as a PSA 10 for $800. Here is the Dark Ampharos Reverse Holo from EX Team Rocket Returns that sold for $1,225. Here is a Rayquaza Holo from EX Emerald that sold for even $2K this week. Here's a Holo Flareon from Unseen Forces that sold for $610. Here's a Gengar Holo from EX Legend Maker that sold for $2,405. Here's a Reverse Holo Dragonite from EX Delta Species, sold for $2,750. Here is a Rayquaza EX Black Star promo that sold for $5,700. Here from EX Power Keepers was a holo Charizard that sold for $1,940, while the reverse holo copy of this card sold for $3,701 this week. Here is a reverse holo Rayquaza from Supreme Victors, sold for $6,100 this week. Here is a Mew Prime card from Heart Gold Soul Silver Triumphant, sold for $2,425. Here we have a Team Up Elite Trainer box that sold for $1,875, while the Team Up Booster box sold this week for $6,150. And that might be a new record price, I'm not sure. Here is an XY base set box that sold for $2,750, while this Evolving Skies booster box sold for $1,941. And then lastly, we have this base 2 booster box that sold for $8,694 this week. On to the Fanatics Collect weekly auction block, we saw this Black Label Charizard VMAX from Shining Fates, sold for $2,280. Here is a Lucky Stadium WotC Black Star promo, sold as a PSA 10 for $3,240, along with this first edition Pidgeot from Jungle that also sold for $3,240. Here is an unlimited Shining Gyarados from Neo Revelation, sold as a PSA 10 for $5,160. And here is an unlimited Shining Charizard that sold for $5,640. Here we have a Japanese black and white promo Giratina EX that sold for an even $6,000, along with this HR Winner promo Charizard card that sold for $6,600. Here is a Ho-Oh Holo from Call of Legends that sold as a PSA 10 for $6,900 this week. Here is a BGS 10 Pristine Luigi Pikachu Full Art card that sold for $7,800. Here is a Japanese Shining Gyarados that sold as a PSA 10 for $8,100 this week. And then lastly on Fanatics, we saw this PSA 10 no rarity symbol Japanese base set Mewtwo that sold for $24,000 this week. And we're going to finish off this recap with some auctions on Alt. Here is a first edition Dark Raichu from Team Rocket that sold for $2,312. Here is a Holo Vaporeon from Skyridge, sold for $2,700. Here is a CGC-10 Gem Mint First Edition Heracross from Neo Genesis, sold for $350, while the PSA 10 copy of this card sold for $4,070. Here, folks, is one of the most difficult EVs to grade in all of creation. It is the WotC Black Star Promo EV. The sold as a PSA 10 this week for $5,550. A couple of these test print cards came by. They're not my cup of tea, but I wanted to go over them. Here is a CGC-10 Chansey that sold for $5,226. A CGC-9 Alakazam Disco Test Print Holo that sold for $5,626. Here is a CGC-9 Disco Test Print Blastoise that sold for $6,034. Here is a CGC-10 Test Print Mewtwo that sold for $7,607, while this CGC-10 Charizard Test Print card sold for $9,060. Here we have the OG Moonbreon from Neo Discovery that sold as a PSA 10. A first edition copy sold for $10,208. Here is an autographed Disco Test Print Venusaur that sold for $11,518 this week. And then last but not least, we saw the CGC-8 Trophy Kangaskhan that sold for $40,200 this week. Man, folks, what a recap. So many big cards came by. What'd you think of it? Let me know in the comments below. I look forward to hearing from you. That's all I got for you today. Thank you for checking out the video, and I will catch you in my next one.